Welcome to another Art City Tattoo class. Today we're going to go over the Immutable Laws of Tattooing, okay? This is a really important class. I suggest that you guys take pen and paper and write down the information that you're going to get in this class, because these are the laws that are going to allow you to create a foundation and an understanding of how tattooing works. That way you can create your own tattoo methods, okay? There's a million ways that tattoos can be done, and there's really no right or wrong way to create a method or a style or a mark on the skin. But there are certain rules that cannot be overlooked, right? So that's what this class is going to be about. So get ready to take some notes and let's get started. The reason why I decided to do this class is because now that I'm in a position where I am teaching, I realize that in order for me to be able to teach properly, I have to go back and I have to become a student myself. Because a lot of the things that I have learned, I've learned over a very long time. I've been tattooing over 15 years, and it's been probably around at least 4 years where it got to the point that I kind of stopped studying, which I don't recommend. I think you should always be, forever a student. But I think there is a phase in a student's career, or in a tattoo artist, or any job or career that you decide to do, where you're just going and trying to learn everything you can. And then there comes a point where you start just doing and you leave studying a little bit behind. So now I'm finding myself trying to trace back and figure out, okay, with my experience now, with everything I know, what are the things that I should know first before I start a tattoo career, right? So this class is the foundation of that, and that's what I'm doing here today, and that's why I think these classes so important, okay? So before we dive into the immutable laws of tattooing, I wanted to sort of define what tattooing is, right? So is tattooing art? Can we say that tattooing is art? Yes. But is all art tattooing? No. Because what is art, right? So art in its most basic form, essentially you're taking multiple elements. It could be 2 or more elements, and you are combining them and synthesizing them in a creative fashion, and you're creating something new with it, right? So you can literally take myself and you can take that camera, you synthesize it into a new video, right? That in itself is art. Anything can be art. So with that definition, we can understand that tattooing is a form of art, but obviously not all art is tattooing, right? But tattooing is a form of art. So when I looked up the definition of tattooing, it says art form. It's a mark with an indelible design by inserting pigment into punctures in the skin. What is indelible? Indelible means of ink and pen, marking or marks that cannot be removed. So by that definition, we know that tattoo is a form of art in the skin that cannot be removed. Let's forget the fact that now we can laser tattooing off and it can be removed later on. But for the sake of this class, art tattoos cannot be removed from the skin once they're in, okay? So how do we tattoo, right? So we use a needle or a group of needles, we soak them in ink, and we puncture the skin with it until the pigment or particles reach the dermis, right? The second layer of the skin. So this is the definition I came up with, which is tattooing is the art form, is the art of permanently or intentionally marking the skin in a precise, controlled, and orderly fashion by puncturing the epidermis with needles soaked in ink and depositing the pigment particles into the dermis, or the second layer of the skin, while creating the least amount of trauma, okay? So it's a balancing act between, I'm not gonna say painting a picture on the skin, because not all tattoos are pictures. Some tattoos are simply just like marks or lines. So we're not gonna say it's picture making, even though the tattoos that are made are pictures, but not all tattooing is picture making, okay? but we are making marks, and these marks, they stay on the skin permanently. Tattooing is essentially a balancing act between being able to puncture the skin with the least amount of trauma and depositing these particles into the skin that create some sort of mark. So what are the immutable principles of this process that can help me, right? So it's to understand my physical limitations that allow me to manipulate the medium at its highest potential, okay? So obviously the fact that we are puncturing the skin and the fact that we're working with ink and we're working with needles and we're working with particles, that has a certain level of limitations. There's only so much we can do, just like everything, right? Like and these laws are like abide by the laws of physics, simply, right? It's the same way as when we paint with acrylic, right? That medium, it has its limitations. When we paint with oil, that medium has its limitations. When we paint with ink, that medium has its limitations. Well, when we paint in the skin, we also have a certain limitation as well, okay? So that's what we're going to go over today. What are our limitations and how we can play with these limitations and manipulate it in a way that we can make a successful tattoo. And these laws, methods can change, methods are variable, but these laws are invariable. No matter what method of tattooing you're using, these laws are going to persist, okay? And that's why I think they're so important, because by knowing these, now you can understand how to create a successful tattoo, okay? It doesn't matter the method that you choose. So I wrote these set of laws based on my own personal experience, on physics, and just my common sense, okay? So a lot of it, it's simply just like things that I think about when I'm tattooing, because I have a tendency in my mind to always try to figure out how things work on its most basic form. So that's the way that I make myself understand concepts, right? So I'm trying to create a way, or I'm creating a way of passing this on to you guys in the most simplest of forms so you can create your own concepts, okay? So the first law is the law of permanency, okay? Once it's inside, it cannot be removed. So what happens when we're tattooing, that we are taking ink. This ink is basically fluid, sometimes water, and it has other types of fluids in there as well, mixed with pigment particles, right? Once we put those pigment particles into the skin, there's no way for those particles to come out of the skin. So once those particles are inside, they cannot be removed, okay? So how do we use this law, right? Well, you know how they say like measure 10 times and cut once? That's what you're gonna do in order to tattoo, okay? You can add pigment gradually, meaning like you can start slow and add a certain amount of pigment, and you can gradually add more pigment to the skin, but you cannot add all the pigment to the skin and then remove it. You cannot erase it and you cannot cover it. So it's very important to have that in mind. It's very similar to when you use watercolor or when you're inking. Once it's on the paper, it cannot be removed. It's not like graffiti, for example, that we can spray and then we let it dry for a couple seconds, we spray over and it's gone. That's not how it works, okay? So it's very, very important to have that in mind. The second law is the law of occupancy, okay? The particles actually take up physical space inside the skin, okay? So what does that mean? The more particles you deposit in a given space, the more saturated the tattoo will look. You can control the value or intensity of a color by depositing less or more pigment particles. This can be done by less passes or by diluting the pigment, right? So, okay, so let's say this is the skin. This is the top layer of the skin right here, which is very thin, right here, top. And then this right here is the dermis. The particles that we're injecting right here ink into the skin, right? So this space right here is where the ink is gonna stay, where it's gonna live. This actually takes up actual physical space in the dermis. So what does that mean? It's the same as when you have an object that is solid versus an object that is like gas or liquid, right? If the particles are tighter together, it's harder, it's more dense, right? So it's the same idea. When you have a tattoo that has more particles, it's visually more dense. So if you add more particles, now you have a tattoo that is either darker or it's more saturated. Why do I say it's either darker or more saturated? If you're only using black, the more particles you add, the darker it'll be. If you're using color, the brighter those colors are gonna be, or the more saturated those colors are gonna be. How can we control this? Well, we control it by two different ways, right? We can control the amount of passes that we're going over the skin, because the machine is puncturing at a certain rate. I don't know the exact number, right? But we know that per every second, let's say there's 100 punctures, right? So if you're staying longer on the skin, that means you're depositing more particles. If you stay less on the skin, you're depositing less particles. So that's one way that you can deposit more or less particles on the skin. The other way that you can deposit less particles on the skin is by taking the pigment and diluting it. So the more water or fluid you have on the pigment, the less particles it has. So you can essentially pass the same amount of times, but you're not going to deposit the same amount of particles. Does that make sense? So that is the second law that we should keep in mind, okay? The third law is the law of viscosity, okay? Viscosity is a property of fluids that has to do with how big the particles in the fluid are, or also by the structure of the particles, right? So the smaller the particles are, the more watery or the less viscosity the fluid has. The bigger the particles, the more viscosity it has, right? Or the more particles that it has in it. It could be one or the other way. So pigment with higher viscosity has a tendency to make darker or more saturated tattoos. Why? Because it has more particles. But the problem here is that the higher the viscosity, the more difficult to get inside the skin, right? Because when you have a fluid that has a higher viscosity, it's harder for it to flow into the pores that you're puncturing into the skin, right? Ideally, a medium viscosity seems to have a higher absorbency and a higher intensity, right? So if it's too liquidy, it doesn't have the same intensity. If it's too thick, it has a really high intensity, but now you have to use bigger needles and create bigger holes, which by effect is going to create more trauma on the skin, right? So finding that medium where you have like medium viscosity is the ideal way of, transferring the pigment into the skin. So I always prefer thicker pigments because I can always dilute them to my desired viscosity. I don't like working with really thin pigments because I feel like I'm not getting the highest amount of saturation. So I rather prefer thick. That's why I tend to use Eternal and Fusion, because they do have that quality of being thicker, and I can always just dilute it a little bit more till I get that desired viscosity, right?
That will be just like the texture of the...
How thick or how thin, yeah. Like how watery or how thick, is it like water or is it like honey?
Okay, it
right?
just depends on the brand that we have.
It depends. Some brands tend to be a little bit more liquidy than others, but even within the brand, also there are colors that are a little bit thicker than other colors. Does that make sense? Yeah, like here you go. Like yellow tends to be really, really thin. And I think honestly it's because the particles are really small. And then you have colors that are a little bit thicker. And colors that actually tend to have white in it tend to be the thickest, because I'm assuming that the particles of the white are very big, right? But again, if it's too thick, it's not gonna flow in the ink with the same ease as when it's thin. So finding something in the middle is the ideal way. You can go thick and you can just dye a little bit you can mix green soap or witch hazel into your pigment, and you can get it to your desired thickness, okay? So now the fourth law is the law of capillary action, okay? This is a law of physics, and it says that the ink is transferred to the needles by cohesion and adhesion forces. By the same forces, it's transferred into the skin. The needles aren't syringes, and we're not injecting anything, okay? So we're not injecting the ink into the skin, and a lot of people have this misconception, and it's very important to understand, because this can make the difference between you hurting the skin and being more careful and causing less trauma on the skin. When you understand what's happening with the fluids, then you understand what you need to do to cause less trauma, right? Because if you think that you're injecting, you're gonna try to force the fluid into the skin. But that's not how fluids work. So what happens with fluids is, let's say this is a drop of liquid, right? And you have these particles inside. They could be, H2O if it's water, or it could be something else, right? Now, these particles, they're called polar. They have polarizing sides, meaning that one side is positive and the other side is negative, okay? So they're like little magnets, okay? Now, these particles, they have a property that's called cohesion, which means that they are attracted to one another, right? So basically, it's like a glue that's sticking the fluid together, okay? It doesn't want to be separate from each other. It wants to be together to one another. Why? Because by being together to one another, they can exchange information, right? They can exchange the hydrogen, or they can exchange something else if it's a different fluid. Now, the particles, so imagine these are all like little octopuses that are holding hands, right? Now, the particles that are on the outer side, they have 8 hands, but they cannot hold 8 hands because on this side, there's nothing to hold, okay? They can only hold here, right? But these particles, they want to hold on the other side because they're magnetic. They want to be pulled into something else. So when a fluid meets with a different substance, it could be a substance or it could be a surface, and that surface is also, it's also a polar surface, because you have non-polar surfaces which by molecular structure, they don't have that magnetism. They're either like plus plus or minus minus, and they're very neutral. They don't have any polarity. But the skin has polarity, right? So what happens is the fluid wants to attach to the skin. That's how water wets objects, right? It wants to be pulled in that direction, but also it has a cohesion force, which means it also wants to bring the rest of the water with it. So as it's being pulled in this direction because it wants to connect with the other surface, it's also pulling the rest of the water with it, right? So when you are dipping your needle into the reservoir of ink, what's happening is that water, that ink is getting pulled up into your needle. And then when you open the pores of the skin, that water gets pulled out of the needle and it soaks into the skin. You understand? So you're not pushing anything in, you're simply just presenting the needle to the skin, and the liquid is absorbed by itself. So your job is really just to control what you're doing and making sure you're not going too deep or too shallow, and you're just simply controlling and directing where those fluids are going to go into the skin, okay? You're not pushing anything in, so you don't have to apply any pressure. You just have to open the pores at the right depth and allow the pigment to be absorbed, okay? So the 5th law is the law of porosity and permeability, okay? So what does that mean? There has to be, for the pigment or for water, fluid, or pigment to be absorbed into the skin, there has to be a certain amount of pores, and the pores have to be large enough for that fluid to flow into it, right? So it's a play between how much viscosity it has versus how many pores, plus how big those pores are. Because we already have pores in our skin, and our skin does absorb substances. If you apply, I don't know, lotion or a cream or something in your skin is going to slowly absorb it. But we don't have time to wait for it to be absorbed. And why does it take so long? And why does it absorb only so much? Because the pores are very, 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 very tight. So there's very, very, very little flow. So what are we doing? What we're doing is we're puncturing the holes into the skin with a certain diameter so that the pigment can flow into those pores, okay? That's what we're doing. That's what I wrote here. There has to be a number of punctures with a certain diameter for the ink to flow in. It's about finding the right balance between the needle gauge, or the diameter of the needle, the ink viscosity, and the number of holes made in a given area. So the law of trauma, okay? This one is super, 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 super important, because I don't care how good a tattoo you make, if you're causing trauma, too much trauma on the skin, is not a good tattoo. That is one of the biggest challenges that we have as tattoo artists, is to apply ink into the skin without hurting or, traumatizing too much of the skin, because we're always hurting it, right? We're always creating punctures that weren't there to begin with. So we are hurting it, but the idea is to just hurt it enough. The law of trauma, it says that too many holes and the skin will break, okay? So let's say this is the surface of the skin. We have a given area here. Let's say we have, 1 inch by 2 inches here of skin, right? And we are putting holes in the skin. These are the holes that we're doing, and the ink is flowing into those holes, right? Do you think that by looking at this skin, is there too much trauma in the skin? No, right? Why? Because there's still connectivity. The tissues are still connected, right? What happens is when you have too many holes like this, if the holes are too close together or you have too many of them, now there's no connectivity in that tissue. So this becomes a hole. This becomes a tear. You have to be able to allow some space in order for the skin to still be connected. The skin still needs to have connective tissue so it doesn't fall apart. Does that make sense? So because of that, by extension of that, in any given area of skin, there's only a certain amount of holes that we can put in there. Too many holes, the skin breaks. Not enough holes is not, you don't get enough pigmentation. So again, it's about finding that balance of how many holes and how many punctures or how many times you can pass over that skin. Let's see what I wrote here. There's a limited amount of holes given into the area. The more holes you make, the more you will saturate a given area. Too many holes in the skin gives in. There has to be connectivity in the tissue. The game is to put enough holes in a given area using the right needle gauge with the right viscosity while making the least amount of trauma and achieving the highest saturation. This can be controlled also by two different ways. It can be controlled by the amount of passes and or the voltage of the machine, right? Because if you have the machine going at a certain rate, again, let's say it's puncturing 100 holes per second, right? And you're passing twice, now you got 200 holes. But if you lower the voltage, now maybe the machine is going at 500 holes per second. So now you can pass 4 times and create the same amount of trauma. So you can play with voltage and you can play with the amount of passes. Obviously, the higher the voltage, the less passes. The lower the voltage, the more passes you're allowed to make. The next law is the law of deepness, okay? Too shallow, no tattoo. Too deep, the ink blows out, okay? So what happens is that the ink must sit in the dermis. If you go past it, you get to the hypodermis and the ink will spread to the soft fatty tissue. The dermis varies in thickness depending on the part of the body. Some places are easier to perforate, so the needle can be adjusted to avoid this. The deeper, the darker. So varying the amount of pressure will vary the value of saturation. Okay, so let me illustrate this for you guys. So this is the epidermis on the top. Okay, so this is the hypodermis and this is the dermis, right? So what happens is you're inserting the needle going past the epidermis into the dermis, right? This has this sort of like hard texture to it. So what happens is once the particles get there, they have nowhere to go. They just stay there. But what happens is if you go past it, here what you have is fat. And fat is soft. So because it's soft, when you hit that fat with the ink seems to kind of spread underneath, right? That's when you get, that's what it's called, the tattoo blowout, right? When you go too deep and it seems like the lines or the color just get a little bit blurry. They're going past the puncture point. That's what happens, is that you went too deep into the skin. Now, what's interesting is that the dermis can actually vary in thickness depending on the part of the body that you're working at, okay? So, for example, the dermis in your, let's say your inner arm right here, which is a very thin skin, it could be this, maybe this thick. But the dermis in your back right here, it's actually like this thick. So you have more forgiveness working somewhere like the back than you have working in the inner arm. So you have to have that in mind, because you have to be able to adjust the needle according to where you're working. So if you're working in the back, it can be a little bit more forgiving, and you can go maybe a little bit deeper, and that's fine. But if you're working here, you got to keep the needle a little bit stuck inside of the cartridge. That way it doesn't go too deep inside, okay? I also wrote here that the deeper that the needle goes, the darker the skin, the ink gets, or that area gets, right? So the amount of pressure can vary the value or saturation. So I just kind of want to work this out here visually so you guys understand why if you go deeper, it gets darker, okay? So let's say that you puncture a hole here into the dermis, and you got this far into the skin, right? But then you poked another puncture here and you went this far. So what's happening here is, in this case, the amount of particles can be deposited all the way from here to here. So let's say you got, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 particles, just for the sake of the example, right? That are going there, where in this case, now you got 10 particles that can be deposited. Because it's gonna deposit particles all the way through that hole, not just at the bottom where it sits. So because there are more particles here, you're actually getting a deeper or a more saturated skin. In the case of black, it's gonna get darker. In the case of color, you're gonna get more saturation, right? So how can we use this to our advantage, where you can actually play with the pressure of the needle and be able to get different values with the same color? So you can use a black, and according to how you apply it, you can get either a lighter version of that color, or you can get a darker version of that color. So we have that we can play with. The next law is the law of voltage. Okay, so voltage controls the speed. The higher the speed, the more holes we make per given pass. The higher the speed, also, the higher the momentum or braking force. This can be advantageous when dealing with tougher skin. The higher the speed, the more holes you make in a given pass. We already kind of covered that, because if the speed is higher, it means it's creating more holes in a given area, right? The higher the speed, also the higher momentum. So if you're going faster, you have a stronger momentum, right? So if you have, which it'll happen, you have people who have different skin types. Some skins are softer, some skins are harder. It depends on age. It also depends on just the quality of the skin of the person. I've found it doesn't even necessarily have to do with the color of the skin, because I've dealt with darker skins that are soft, and I've dealt with darker skins that are harder, and vice versa. So I don't know what makes some skins harder than others, but it's just a fact, right? So if you're dealing with a skin that has a little bit, it's a little bit harder, you can increase your speed, and you're gonna have more momentum to break that skin. So, you know, if I'm normally working at, like, say 8 volts, and I get somebody that has hard skin, I'll usually increase it maybe by 1 volt to be able to get the same effect that I would get on somebody that has, you know, regular or softer skin.
What about people that are overweight?
It has nothing to do with that. I don't know what it is. Some people just have harder tissue. I don't know why. But the same goes for somebody, like, if you notice that somebody is, like, you know, has young, soft, kind of buttery skin, you can lower your voltage down a little bit, and you're gonna get the same effect as if you were going at your normal speed. So it goes both ways. The slower the speed, the less amount of punctures per pass, obviously, right? So how can we use this to our advantage? Let's say that we are doing a tattoo where we gotta do a lot of blends, and we know we're gonna pass over that area a certain amount of times because we have to mix colors together, or we're transitioning from one value to another value. Then you don't want to go at a high speed, because again, there's only so many holes that you can poke on that skin. So what do? We lower the voltage. What happens when you have slow speed and you move your hand fast? What happens is that the needle is going to skip the skin. So let's say this is the surface of the skin, and you're going slow, but you're moving your hand fast. What happens is the skin, the needle is gonna skip like this. And that's how people do the, I don't know, the whip shading or the little dots that they do. I can't remember right now. It's not coming to me the style where they do the dots, but you know where you're shading and you get dots essentially, right? That's how they do it. Very slow speed, kind of fast hand movement. Not too fast, because if you're moving too fast and the needle's going too slow, what happens is you don't give the needle enough time to retract back out of the skin. So what happens is you tug the skin. But so you have to find a sort of balance between moving fast but not too fast, because if not, you hurt the skin because you're not letting the needle come out of the skin. The reverse of that is fast speed and a slow hand. So if you have your needle going really fast and you're moving your hand very slowly, what's gonna happen is the opposite. You get this. So the needle now is not skipping. So this can be done for doing very solid lines, or like to highly saturate an area, right? But the same thing happens. If you're going too slow, you hurt the skin, you break the skin. Why? Because you're creating too many holes, too many punctures in a given area. So it's all about balance. It's a balancing act. And this is something you're going to figure out most of the time by just tattooing and practice. And this is something that I've realized very intuitively over time, and also trial and error. But being able to, now that I have the experience, I'm able to kind of just go back and break it down in my mind and be able to give you guys this explanation so you guys get it from the beginning, But again, practice is going to make perfect. And these are things that you're going to realize on your own anyways, if you're paying attention or you're being intentional about learning as you're tattooing, which you should be doing anyways. So slow bolt for blending colors, less trauma, and fast for packing quickly, okay? So if there's an area that I just know it's going to be a background and it's one solid color, I'll raise my voltage up and I'll just pass quickly, and it'll pack and it'll make the area solid. If I'm going slow, if I want to, like I was saying, if I want to blend or, just pass many times over an area, then I slow down my voltage. The next law is the law of needle extension. Too far out hurts the skin. Too far in, it hurts the skin. So there has to be a happy medium where you hang your needle out of the tube. When it sticks out too far, the needle usually gets caught in the skin and it tugs it. Like we did it the other day and we tried it. You remember that we were doing that video and it tugged the skin? That's one of the things that happens. The other thing that happens is, so the needle, when it's sticking too far out, it's not retracting back enough into the tube to be able to collect fluid and pass it onto the skin. So you might, even though you might not be getting the skin caught, you'll find yourself not pigmenting or inking the skin at the same rate because the needle's not retracting enough. When it's too far in, when it's too hidden, it doesn't quite reach the dermis, and you will find yourself passing over the skin too many times, causing irritation and getting little pigmentation. So the opposite of that is the needle doesn't go far in. It's not going deep enough. So you're going to be like, what the hell is going on? Why is this not coloring? And quick note to that, a lot of the times it may not be coloring because, and it happens all the time, if you're drying your needle with a piece of paper towel, sometimes a little ball of paper towel is going to get caught in the needle. And when that happens, you can actually color, but you're not going to be able to color the same. So that's one thing that you definitely want to check always. Like if you're painting, if you're tattooing and you're not getting enough color on the skin, check the needle depth, but also check the needle itself. Look at the needle, pull it out and see if it has a little ball in it. If it has a ball in it, just pull it out with your hand on a paper towel. And that's the problem. But if it's not that, most likely it's either too far out. When it's too far in, like I said, it's not going deep enough in the skin. So you're going to be passing, you're going to be like, what the hell? It will color if you pass a lot of times, but now you're passing a lot of times. So you're creating a whole lot of irritation in the skin for no reason. And the skin just looks terrible and you're not going to get the same coloration, okay? So keep that in mind. Okay, so the next law is the law of tension. Stretch the skin in order to saturate it. How? When you stretch and create tension, the needle can pierce deeper and saturate more. okay? This is great for outlines and packing. The needle, but what happens is when you have the needle, let's say this is the normal texture of the skin. Obviously not at this level, but just for the sake of the explanation. But when you stretch the skin, instead it looks like this, okay? So when the skin is completely stretched and you're piercing the needle into the skin is not gonna damper the needle. It's not gonna move, right? It's gonna stay stiff. And by staying stiff, you can go further in and you can saturate more, for sure. But what happens is if you're trying to blend, or if you're trying to create like let's say you're doing black and gray and you're stretching the skin and you're trying to get a smooth transition, you're not gonna get a smooth transition because the skin cannot move. It cannot damper the punch. And what happens is your needle starts skipping again. So you get that sort of choppy look, which you can use, and it has like a really cool look to it if you want to use it on purpose. But if you want something smoother, what you do is you let go of the skin. And now when you let go of the skin and the needle's entering the surface of the skin, the needle kind of the skin kind of moves along with the needle. It can move up and down, it can move side to side. So what does is it's dampering that hit. And because it's dampering, now you get a smoother sort of transition between color, okay? You don't get that kind of skipping, but you don't also get the same amount of saturation. So this is good for like gradually adding pigment into the skin. Say you're doing a black and gray piece and you want to kind of gradually create like a smooth transition. You kind of let go of the skin and you let the skin sort of move along with the needle. But if you just want to like pack the color in, or you want to do like a solid line, you want to make sure that skin is stretched. And this is a good habit to get into, like knowing when to stretch and when not to. Because, for example, me, when I started tattooing, I would always stretch the skin, which it helped me create like very saturated tattoos. But I have the bad habit of never letting go. So sometimes when I'm doing black and gray, like I'll notice my stuff getting choppy and I'm like, crap, I gotta let go of the skin. And I forget all the time because I'm not in the habit of it. I got in the habit too early of stretching. So just know when to stretch and when not to stretch. The next one is going to be the law of precision, okay? This one is just kind of my common sense. Basically what it means is that the closer you are to the skin physically, the higher amount of focus you have and the more precision you have. So the closer you are to the skin, the higher focus and precision. The further you are from the skin, as you distance yourself from the skin, the less precision that you have, but the easier to see the overall drawing and the easier you can get hand movement, okay? It's not the same to be able to do this down here than do this up here. This is more difficult. You can't do this here. You can do this here and you can get real precise, but when you want to color, you want to put yourself above the tattoo and kind of have this type of movement, and you have a more panoramic view of what you're doing, and it allows you to look at the whole picture or the whole drawing that you're creating. But when you want to do like a very, very precise line, or you want to get like into like a little corner or something, you either get yourself down to the tattoo or you bring the tattoo up to your head, okay? This is really important because this is a practice that I have. When I'm outlining, I always have the tattoo at eye level. When I'm shading, I have the tattoo at kind of like waist level, right here. The next law is the law of alterations, okay? So like I stated earlier, once the pigment particles are inside the skin, they're not going anywhere. So the next law that we have to cover is the law of alterations. So once it's in the skin, it's very hard to adjust. Colors or values can be slightly altered once they're already in the skin. So there's only so much that once you have the color in the skin, there's only so much you can push it one way or the other. You cannot completely change a color into a different color once it's already in the skin. So colors or values can be slightly altered once they're already in the skin. An area can be darkened by adding a darker pigment, or it can be lightened by adding a lighter pigment. However, the changes will be subtle and not significant. You can modify the color slightly, but cannot completely change it. Once it's in there, it's in there. If there's an issue with trauma, which means like if you already have a color in there, you already made a bunch of holes in the skin. So if you want to adjust a color, you have to understand that skin's already hurt. So what do you have to do? You have to lower the voltage, because that way you can create less trauma in the skin. Also, if an area of the skin is already open, it means it's already absorbent. So you don't have to poke more holes. You can simply just like lightly graze over that area, and it'll adjust the color with, you know, the new color that you added. It's best to mix colors outside of the skin, although slight modifications are normal and are common practice. So it's common practice for me to do a tattoo, and as I go on my break and I come back or something, I may find a spot that I notice is maybe a little bit too light, or maybe it's too cool and I want to warm it up, or it's too warm and I want to cool it off, or whatever it may be, or I want to just slightly adjust the value. That is common practice. I do it in just about every tattoo that I make. But I don't rely on this to blend colors inside the skin, because again, you only have so many holes you can put in the skin. So if you're blending and you're trying to change the colors within the skin, you're breaking the skin as you're doing that. So the best practice is to mix the colors in the caps outside of the skin, trying to get the right colors before you put them into the skin. If you need to make a light adjustment, then you can do that as common practice.
Is that the reason why it's so difficult to do cover-ups?
In what sense?
Because the skin is packed of color and it also has trauma already.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like...
Well, that trauma is to some degree already gone because the skin healed over. Okay. And if you're doing a cover-up, ideally it has to be a tattoo that has a few years already. Because what happens to those particles is that they get engulfed by white blood cells. The moment those particles enter the skin, your immune system is going to go crazy. And then it sends white cells to the area, and those white cells, they try to encapsulate the particle of pigment in the fixed area, because it doesn't want those particles to go anywhere else in the body, because they can move if they're free, right? So that's the job of the white cells. But those white cells, they have a lifespan. They die. So when they die, they sort of let go of the particle. They die, and then automatically the immune system knows it has to send another white cell to engulf that particle. So this is a constant process that's happening in your skin all the time throughout your lifetime when you have a tattoo. In that process of like engulfing, dying, let it go, getting a new particle, those particles do start breaking down a little bit. So they lose the intensity. That's why when you have a tattoo that is older, it's easier to cover up than somebody a tattoo that's fresh. Because again, those particles are taking up space. So when you're tattooing, you're basically blending the new particles into the old particles, and you're getting a brand new color. You can never get like a fresh, if you're applying red on skin, you're gonna get that red. But if there's something already there, you're never gonna get the same red that's on the bottle. It's gonna be a combination of what's already there with what you have on your bottle. It's never gonna be the same. Even though it might look kind of similar when it's fresh, when it heals and it all blends together, it's not gonna be the same. So that's why the best practice when you are tattooing is to work a la prima. So a la prima is it's an oil painting style, which is done by you're applying the color. So when you're working a la prima, it means that you're not layering. It means that you're getting the exact color that needs to be in that exact given space, and you're putting it there. You're not like putting one color and then blending with another color. Why? Because with oil you can't do that. When you're working with an oil painting, if you have already a pigment in that area, you mix the next pigment in, it gets all blended together because it doesn't dry. That's why when you're painting with oil, a lot of times you have to work a la prima if you want to get the painting done in the same sitting. Otherwise, you have to wait for the oil to dry, and then you can apply another layer on top. But in the case of tattooing, you can't just wait for the pigments to dry and apply another layer, same as with oil. So you have to get the exact color with the exact value, with the exact saturation that you need, and put it in that given area. So that's what I mean by working a la prima. So it's like the closest thing that I can compare tattooing to is kind of like watercolor or like inking. You can add, but you cannot subtract. The next law is the law of hierarchy. What that means to me is that darks will stain lights, okay? So dark colors are gonna stain light colors. So darker colors will stain lighter colors, cooler colors will stain warmer colors, okay? It's very important to know that, because by understanding that, you can create an order of tattooing to avoid this from happening. If you don't know that your darks are gonna stain your lights, you might put a light before you put a dark. But if you know that the dark stain the lights, then you're always gonna tend to put the darker colors first and then move your way into the lighter colors later. Same way works for cooler colors and warmer colors. Your darker, cooler colors first, your darker, warmer colors later, and then your medium, cooler colors, then your medium, warmer colors, your light, cooler colors, your warm, lighter colors. Kind of in that way. That's how I work anyways, because I don't like staining my tattoos, because it's not gonna look the same when it's like nice and clean and neat, and when you have a tattoo that's stained up. A lot of the time the staining goes away after it heals, but again, it doesn't look good. If somebody's paying you a bunch of money to do a tattoo, they want to be able to look at it when it's done, and they want to be able to see what it's supposed to look like, not wait until it heals to see what it's actually intended to be. So having that order is going to help you create a tattoo that's like very nice, crisp, and clean.
Can you repeat that? So you said dark.
So dark, medium, light, right? If you have a dark, let's say that you're working with dark cools, with cool colors and warm colors, right? Your dark cools are going to go before your dark warms. Your medium cools are going to go before your medium warms. Your light cools are going to go before your light warms.
Okay.
So you go like this. The law of transparency. Medium to dark colors do not affect black, okay? So if you have black already in an area, and for some reason you have to, color something next to the black, and you have to grace the black over, that black is not going to be affected by medium to dark colors. It's going to stay black. It's going to stay the same. Black is most affected by lighter colors, especially those mixed with white. So if you have black already in your tattoo, and you're putting like either a light gray or any color that's mixed with white, you cannot grace that needle over the black, because it's going to adjust the black. That black is not going to be black anymore. It's going to be some mixture of maybe like a gray or something. It's not going to get extremely light, but it's not going to be as black as it should be. So just be very mindful of that. What's up?
That's how they have those blackouts, and then they do a design on top with white. And
yeah, because the white.
Okay.
In this case, you're talking about somebody who tattooed themselves black. They let that heal, and then they put white on top. Okay? In this case, I'm talking about within the same tattoo session.
Okay.
So let's say I'm working on an outline. The outline is black. And then I have to color in certain spaces, and those colors are going to be a light gray. You got to make sure that needle does not go over the black, because the black is going to reflect that it was changed. There will be some sort of adjustment there. If you're working with a medium color, like say you're working with black, and then you get like a dark red, you can, no problem, with no concern, you can grace over that black with that dark red, and it'll be fine. But if it's a lighter color, of that color has white, then you have to be more careful. Let's see, the law of transparency. The lighter the skin, the more transparent it is. Okay, so melanin, which determines how lighter or how darker someone is, it's on the epidermis, or the upper surface area of the skin, right? So what ends up happening is the epidermis, it works like a piece of tracing paper. It's semi-transparent. But the more melanin it has, the less transparent it is. It starts becoming opaque. So what happens is that the whiter the skin, the more intense the color will look, and the more values you can use. The whiter the skin, the more intense the colors will look, and the more values you can use. The darker the skin, the more dull the colors will look, and the less value you can use. So as the skin starts getting darker, you're only going to be able to use less and less and less values, to the point that you can only use black. Like if somebody's extremely dark, don't even mind putting anything other than black in there. If somebody's extremely on the opposite side, you can put every color in the rainbow, every value, every saturation. It doesn't matter, because their skin is the most transparent that it can be. Okay? So especially once it heals over. And the 15th law is the law of control, okay? What this law says is that every single movement you make will be reflected on the skin. It's like cause and effect, okay? Simply put, every action will have an exact opposing reaction. If you move your hands erratically and inconsistently, your tattoo will show it. If you move with rhythmic pace and control, your tattoo will also show it. So you must pace yourself and control your breath. That way you can get like a nice, smooth looking tattoo, okay? This is something that I developed in like the first few years of my career, especially with black and gray. Black and gray is the best way to practice this because black and gray, you're working with diluted inks, meaning that how smooth a color looks on the skin is 100% dependent on your hand movement. If you want to practice that, the best thing to do is to do it with black and gray. What I used to do is I used to create a rhythm in my head. Like when I would be passing, I would be like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Like it depends on what rhythm you want to create, but it doesn't matter the rhythm or the pace. What matters is the consistency in it, because that's what's going to give you like a smooth lay. And then the last law is the law of the mirror, okay? This is very important. Maybe it should have been the first law, but it was the last one that I thought of. Because I try to make these in as much of an order as I could, from, you know, beginning of tattooing and understanding what tattooing is to the end of a tattoo. But this one came and I didn't want to leave it out because I think it's very important. And it applies to everything in life, which is you cannot achieve before you become. You cannot make orange juice out of a lemon. If you're a lemon, you're going to make lemonade. If you're an orange, you're going to make orange juice. If you're a mango, you're going to make mango juice, right? I love mango juice. So you can only go as far as your knowledge goes. You will project what you are inside in your tattoos or in your art. Challenge yourself, but don't bite more than you can chew. Practice, study, grow as a human. Be diligent, be thorough, be organized. Find your inner peace. Be kind, be generous, and well-intended, and your tattoos are going to show just that. So these are my 16 immutable laws of tattooing. I hope they help you guys. If, by the way, you haven't seen this video right here, make sure that you check it out. But really, guys, I really hope that helped. I put a lot of thought and a lot of love and a lot of good intention in these laws, hoping that they really can help you like move forward in creating the best possible tattoos that you can. There is a million methods of tattooing out there. And the thing about methods is that we all create our own methods. So it's very hard for somebody to learn someone's method and then follow it exactly to a T, because methods are created dependent on who we are as people. So if I tell you, no, you need to move your hand like this or at this speed or whatever, like that might not be comfortable for you. And it can become very, very difficult for you to learn the craft if you're basing your methods and the way of doing it on the way that someone else is. So I wanted to create these laws to go to the deepest foundation of what tattooing is. So when you have this understanding, you can simply just create your own methods, your own way of doing it without breaking these laws. Because these laws are going to apply to every single method of tattooing, okay? So hope that helps. Stay curious, stay creative. And I'll see you guys in the next video, okay? Hope it helps. Oh, do you have any questions? No? Okay, good. Take care, guys. I'll see you in the next one, okay? Bye.